Pick up the pencil. Fill in 7 across, the one you already knew before you read the clue. Right now, in the half second between reading and writing, a network of cells in your hippocampus fired in a pattern it has fired 10,000 times before. And that is exactly the problem. Crosswords and puzzles do almost nothing for memory after 60 because they run on circuits you already built, and a circuit you already own gets no stronger from being used. The answer is that memory doesn't grow from practice. It grows from difficulty, from the specific kind of strain that happens only when the brain is forced to build a connection it does not yet have. And that strain is the one thing a familiar puzzle is engineered to remove. Here's where it gets strange, and here's why the next 20-odd minutes matter more than the sentence you just read. The brain is not a muscle, even though every article you've read compares it to one. A muscle grows from load. The brain grows from something closer to error, from a signal that means that didn't work. Rewire. And a crossword you can finish is by definition a task that worked. So the question underneath the title isn't whether puzzles help. It's this: what physically has to happen inside a 70-year-old skull for a new memory to stick? And why does the thing that triggers it feel almost nothing like the thing everyone told you to do? Let me start with a number that sounds like it settles the argument and doesn't. In 2018, a research group at the University of Aberdeen followed people who had done crosswords and number puzzles for years and tracked their cognitive scores across a decade. The headline that traveled said puzzle doers had brains 10 years younger. You've probably seen that phrase. I'd rather be straight with you than repeat it. The study found that regular puzzlers started from a higher baseline and declined at roughly the same rate as everyone else. They were sharper to begin with. The puzzles didn't slow the fall. They may have just been what sharp people happen to do. That distinction is the whole video, and almost no one tells you about it. So what actually changes in the brain when a memory forms? Picture two neurons, two nerve cells with a narrow gap between them called a synapse. When one fires and the other fires right after, the gap between them physically remodels. Receptors get added to the receiving surface. The connection gets faster and easier to trigger. Do it enough, and the two cells behave as one unit. Neuroscientists call this long-term potentiation, and the plain English version is simple. Cells that fire together, wire together. That's the entire hardware of memory, not a filing cabinet but a landscape of connections that deepen where they're used and fade where they're not. Now here's the part that breaks the puzzle myth. Long-term potentiation only remodels a connection while that connection is still changing. Once two neurons have wired together tightly, firing them again does almost nothing new. The receptors are already in place. The path is already carved. This is called synaptic saturation. A trench dug to full depth doesn't get deeper because more water runs through it. And a crossword clue you can answer is a trench you dug decades ago. The word EP for a fencing sword. The four-letter river. Every time you solve it, you're running water through a channel already cut to the bedrock. Pleasant. Fluent. Neurologically almost silent. Why does that fluency feel like exercise then? Because your brain rewards retrieval that succeeds. Pulling a stored answer up releases a small hit of dopamine, the same neurochemical that fires when you find your keys or remember a name at the tip of your tongue. It feels productive because completion feels good. But feeling good and rewiring are different events. You can spend an hour in a state of pleasant, confident retrieval and lay down not one new durable connection, which raises the harder question: if using what you already know doesn't build memory, what does? The answer comes from an idea that sounds backwards the first time you hear it. It's called desirable difficulty, named by the psychologist Robert Bjork at UCLA, who spent 40 years running experiments on how humans actually retain things versus how they think they do. His finding, repeated across hundreds of studies: the conditions that make learning feel easy and smooth are usually the ones that make it vanish, and the conditions that feel effortful and frustrating are usually the ones that make it last. Struggle isn't the obstacle to memory. Under the right shape, struggle is the mechanism. Think of it as the difference between reading a map and being lost. Read a map of a city and you'll forget it by dinner. Get lost in that same city for 2 hours. Take the wrong turn. Backtrack. Curse. Finally find the square by dead reckoning. And you will own that route for 20 years. The being lost is the encoding. Your brain, faced with a problem it cannot solve from stored routine, is forced to lay new track. The frustration you feel is not a sign the method is failing. It's the sound of the track being laid. So why do puzzles feel like the Lost in the City version when they're actually the map? Because a good crossword sits in a very narrow band. Hard enough to feel like work, easy enough that you almost always finish. That's exactly the band designed to produce the feeling of effort with the reality of retrieval. The clue is novel. The knowledge it retrieves is not. You are being tested on the trench, presented in a new costume. And here's a recognition beat I'd bet lands for you. Think of someone you know who has done the same daily puzzle for 15 years and is genuinely excellent at it, and is exactly as forgetful about where they put their glasses as everyone else their age. The skill got sharper, the memory system underneath didn't move. Now let me name the thing that actually moves it, because this is where the physics of the brain gets beautiful. The brain runs on a trade-off that engineers would recognize instantly. It's called the stability-plasticity dilemma. A memory system has to be stable enough to hold what it learned, but plastic enough to learn something new. And those two demands fight each other. Make the system too stable and it can't take in anything new. Make it too plastic and every new thing erases the old. Every learning machine ever built, biological or artificial, has to solve this trade-off. Your brain solves it by keeping plasticity switched off by default and only switching it on when a specific chemical signal says, "This is new, this is unpredicted, pay attention." What is that signal? It's a burst of neuromodulators, acetylcholine and noradrenaline chief among them, released when the brain encounters something it did not predict. Prediction error. Your brain is, at its core, a prediction machine. It's constantly forecasting the next second, the next word, the next feeling, and mostly getting it right. When the forecast is right, nothing needs to change and plasticity stays off. When the forecast is wrong, when reality delivers something the model didn't expect, that error fires the neuromodulators, and the neuromodulators are what open the window for long-term potentiation to occur. No prediction error, no window, and a puzzle you can finish generates almost no prediction error at all. You predicted you'd solve it. You did. This is the cross-field collision I want you to hold on to, because it reframes everything. In machine learning, there's a principle that governs how artificial neural networks learn most efficiently. You get the most improvement per unit of effort when the error is large but not overwhelming. When the model is wrong in a way it can still correct. Train a network only on examples it already gets right, and its weights barely change. You're wasting compute. The formal name is the learning progress signal, and living brains obey a version of the same law. Your neurons update most where the surprise is highest and still survivable. A crossword feeds your brain the examples it already gets right. It's the most expensive way imaginable to change nothing. If that just reframed what keeping sharp even means, and there's a deeper layer coming, about why some kinds of difficulty age the brain instead of building it, which is the distinction that decides whether any of this works. Subscribe now, because that section is a few minutes off, and it's the reason I made this whole thing. So if difficulty is the mechanism, is the answer just to do harder puzzles? Cryptic crosswords, brutal Sudoku, the diabolical tier? Not quite. And here's the trap. Harder puzzles still recruit the same narrow slice of your cognition, pattern matching against stored vocabulary and rules. You get better at that slice, and only that slice. The technical name for this ceiling is the lack of far transfer. Cognitive scientists distinguish near transfer, getting better at things very similar to what you trained, from far transfer, getting better at genuinely different tasks. The Aberdeen data and a large 2010 study run by the BBC and the MRC in Britain, over 11,000 people put through 6 weeks of brain training, landed on the same wall. People got measurably better at the trained games and showed essentially no improvement on anything they hadn't trained. The puzzle makes you a better puzzler. The transfer to your actual life, to remembering the conversation from Tuesday, is close to zero. What produces far transfer? Then, what kind of difficulty actually generalizes? Novelty that forces the brain to build new representational structure, not just retrieve old ones. And that is a physically different event inside the skull. When you learn something structurally new, a language you don't speak, an instrument you can't play, a route through a city you've never walked, your brain doesn't just strengthen existing synapses, it grows new ones, and in one specific region it grows new neurons entirely. That region is the hippocampus, the seahorse-shaped structure deep in the temporal lobe that acts as the brain's indexing system for new memories. The hippocampus is one of the only places in the adult human brain where fresh neurons are born throughout life, a process called adult neurogenesis. Here's the physical model to hold. Picture the hippocampus as a switchboard in an old telephone exchange, and the operator plugging cables to connect callers. Every new experience is a new call that needs routing. If every call is the same three people phoning each other, the crossword, the Sudoku, the familiar loop, the operator plugs the same three jacks all day and the rest of the board sits cold and dark. Learning something genuinely unfamiliar lights up jacks that haven't been touched in years and forces new cables to be run. Neurogenesis is the exchange hiring a new operator because call volume in unfamiliar territory finally got high enough to justify it. Familiar puzzles never raise that volume. They keep three lines busy and let the switchboard shrink around them. There's a study I trust on this, and I'll give it to you carefully because the details matter. In 2013, Denise Park at the University of Texas at Dallas ran what she called the Synapse project. She took adults aged 60 to 90 and split them into groups for 14 weeks. Some did familiar, comfortable activities, listening to music, doing crosswords, socializing. Others learned something genuinely demanding and new, digital photography or quilting, skills that required holding unfamiliar information in mind and using it under pressure. The result was clean. The groups that learned the hard new skill showed real gains in memory. The groups doing pleasant, familiar activities did not. Same hours, same commitment. The difference wasn't effort. It was novelty and sustained difficulty, the switchboard being forced to grow. So what is this? The thing in the title. The thing you actually have to do for a puzzle to earn its place. It's not a different puzzle. It's a change in what the puzzle demands of your brain, and there are three ways to force it, all free, none requiring you to buy anything or download anything. Let me give you the first and most useful, then a hard signal you'll feel in your own body when you're doing it right. The first is delayed effortful retrieval, and it's the single highest value move in the science of memory. Here's the drill. Take whatever you're trying to actually remember, not a crossword answer, but a real thing. The names of the four people you met at the gathering last week, the 3 points your doctor made, the plot of the book you finished. Do not look it up. Sit with it and pull hard from memory until it either surfaces or you fail. That failure, the reaching, the almost having it, is the event. When you finally retrieve it or finally look it up after genuinely struggling, the connection remodels far more than it ever would from rereading. This is called the testing effect, and it is one of the most replicated findings in all of psychology. Reading something 4 times feels productive and does little. Reading it once and forcing yourself to recall it 3 times, failing partway each time, builds memory that lasts months. If that one idea was new to you, hit like. It's the signal that tells the algorithm to show this to someone else who's been doing the comfortable version and wondering why nothing sticks. Here's how you'll know it's working, and it's counterintuitive enough that most people quit right before the benefit. It has to feel like failure. If retrieval is smooth, you learn nothing. The tip of the tongue state, that maddening sensation of a word sitting just out of reach, is not a malfunction. It's the exact neurological moment when the connection is weak enough to be strengthened and active enough to be found. Chase that feeling. Most people flee it and reach for their phone, and the phone every time is the crossword. It hands you the trench. But now the layer I promised, and this is where I have to be honest that the science gets less certain, because 2 things that both look like hard are not the same inside the brain. There's difficulty that builds, and there's difficulty that just floods you with stress. And the second, one actively damages the tissue you're trying to protect. When a task is too hard, unpredictable, and threatening, your adrenal glands release cortisol, the stress hormone, and the hippocampus is dense with cortisol receptors. Sustained high cortisol doesn't build the switchboard, it corrodes it. Chronic stress has been shown to suppress the very neurogenesis that learning depends on. So the answer isn't make everything as hard as possible. Grinding a puzzle in frustration for 2 hours, feeling stupid and cornered, can do more harm than the gentle version does nothing. The window you want is effortful but safe. Struggle you chose, not threat you can't escape. Depending on which researcher you ask, this line between productive difficulty and toxic stress sits in a slightly different place for every person. And honestly, nobody has mapped it precisely yet. What's clear is that the feeling you're after is engaged reaching, not cornered panic. Which is why the second method matters, spacing. Not because it's harder, but because it reintroduces just enough difficulty to reopen the window without the stress. Here's the physical reason it works. Every time a memory starts to fade, the connection weakens, and reviewing it right at the edge of forgetting forces a full rebuild. And each rebuild lays the track down thicker and more permanent. Review too soon while it's still fresh, and there's nothing to rebuild. You're running water through a wet trench. This is the spacing effect, first measured by Hermann Ebbinghaus in Germany in 1885, testing his own memory on nonsense syllables. And its central finding has survived 140 years of attempts to knock it down. Space your recall attempts across days. Catch each one right as it's slipping, and you build memory that 100 repetitions in a single afternoon can't touch. The forgetting is not the enemy. The forgetting is what makes the next remembering count. And the third, which folds the whole thing together, novelty layered onto anything you already do. You don't have to abandon the crossword. You have to break its predictability. Do it in a language you're learning. Do it. Then an hour later, try to reconstruct 3 answers from memory. Alternate with a skill that has no verbal component at all. Because here's a piece of the architecture most people never hear. Memory isn't one system. There's declarative memory, the facts and events you can state out loud run largely through the hippocampus. And there's procedural memory, the how-to knowledge of the hands and body, riding a bike, shaping a chord, run through the basal ganglia and cerebellum, structures buried beneath and behind that barely touch the hippocampal switchboard at all. A crossword trains one narrow lane of one system. Learning to play 3 chords on a cheap second-hand instrument, or fold a complex origami crane, or type with the other hand, lights up territory the crossword cannot reach on its best day. Let me put the 4 models together, because separately they're tips and together they're a mechanism. Long-term potentiation is the remodeling that only happens while a connection is still changing. Synaptic saturation is why a mastered skill goes neurologically quiet. Prediction error is the signal that opens the plasticity window, and it only fires on the unexpected. And neurogenesis is the switchboard growing new operators when unfamiliar call volume finally justifies it. Stack those and one sentence falls out. Your brain rewires only where it is surprised, only when you make it reach for what it cannot smoothly reach. Every one of those conditions is the exact opposite of a puzzle you can finish. So here is the honest reframe of the title. Crosswords aren't worthless. If you love them, keep them. They're pleasant. They keep language warm. And a happy hour is not a wasted one. But do not mistake them for memory training, because the thing that felt like exercise was mostly retrieval of what you already owned. The training is the reaching that fails before it succeeds, the tip of the tongue you've been taught to escape, the route you got lost on, the skill your hands don't have yet. Tell me in the comments, what's the last genuinely new thing you tried to learn? One where you were bad at it long enough to feel it. Not a puzzle. A real one. I want to see how many of us have gone years without that feeling and called ourselves sharp anyway. And if there's someone in your life who does the same puzzle every morning and worries about their memory, share this with them, because they're working hard at the one thing that was never going to move. The brain doesn't keep what you practice. It keeps what almost defeated you.